Have you ever thought about someone you never actually had? Maybe you never dated them. Maybe you never kissed them. Maybe you never even told them how you felt. And yet, somehow, they still occupy a strange amount of space in your mind. You remember small conversations, a look, a message, a moment that probably meant nothing to them, but somehow meant everything to you. You tell yourself that you should be over it. After all, there was never really a relationship to lose. But that's exactly what makes it so difficult. Because sometimes, the hardest person to forget isn't the person you loved and lost. It's the person you never got the chance to have. And psychology gives us some fascinating reasons why. The human mind doesn't like incomplete stories. When something has a clear beginning, middle, and ending, our brain has something it can organize. You met someone. You became close. The relationship changed. And eventually, it ended. Painful? Absolutely. But there is still an ending. When you never actually had a relationship with someone, there may be no ending at all. There is only a question. What if? What if I had said something? What if they felt the same? What if we had met at a different time? What if I had been more confident? What if they hadn't moved away? What if that one conversation had continued? And those questions can keep a person psychologically present long after they have physically disappeared. You aren't necessarily holding on to the person. Sometimes you're holding on to the possibility. And possibility is incredibly difficult for the human mind to let go of. Because reality has limits. Possibility doesn't. You may think you're missing that person. But sometimes you're actually missing the version of your life that you imagined with them. That's very different. Your mind can take a few real details and build an entire story around them. Maybe they were kind to you once. Maybe you had an unusually deep conversation. Maybe you felt understood around them. Maybe there was chemistry. And your mind begins filling in everything you don't know. You imagine how they would treat you, how they would understand you, what conversations you would have, what your relationship might look like. And eventually, the imagined version of the person can become much larger than the real person ever was. You aren't interacting with reality anymore. You're interacting with a possibility. And possibilities are almost impossible to disprove because you never got to experience the ordinary parts. You never saw how they behaved when they were stressed. You never had disagreements. You never discovered their annoying habits. You never experienced the boring Tuesday afternoons. You only experienced the highlights. And the human mind is very good at turning highlights into an idealized story. There's another psychological mechanism at work: uncertainty. When you know exactly how someone feels about you, there is less room for fantasy. But when you don't know, your mind keeps checking. Did that message mean something? Why did they look at me like that? Why did they suddenly become distant? Why did they reply so quickly that night? Why did they remember that tiny detail? Why didn't they say anything? Every unanswered question becomes another reason to think about them. And this is where uncertainty becomes powerful. The brain keeps searching for an answer. It's almost like having a mental tab open that you never close. You can be busy. You can meet other people. You can go to work. You can watch a movie. You can spend an entire day without consciously thinking about them. And then suddenly, something reminds you. A song, a place, a smell, a sentence. And the entire emotional story comes back. Not necessarily because that person is your soulmate, but because your brain never received a satisfying conclusion. There's something else happening. When we don't have enough information about someone, the brain fills in the gaps. Imagine you only know 10 things about a person, but you spend months thinking about them. Your mind can unconsciously create hundreds of additional details. You start assuming what they would like, how they would behave, what kind of partner they would be, how well they would understand you. But here's the problem. You don't actually know. You're working with incomplete information. And the less reality you have, the more space imagination has. This is why someone you never dated can sometimes seem almost perfect. Not because they were perfect, but because reality never had enough opportunity to prove otherwise. A real relationship introduces friction. Fantasy doesn't. Fantasy can give you the perfect conversation every time, the perfect response, the perfect timing, the perfect connection. Real people can't compete with an imaginary version of themselves. There's an even deeper possibility. Maybe you're not attached to the person themselves. Maybe they represent something you desperately wanted. Being understood, being chosen, being appreciated, being desired, feeling safe, feeling interesting, feeling seen. Maybe that person appeared during a period of your life when you needed one of those things, and your brain connected the person with the feeling. So now, when you think about them, you're not only remembering them, you're remembering who you were when you were around them. That's why certain people can become symbols in our minds. They represent a version of ourselves. Maybe you felt more confident around them, more attractive, more intelligent, more alive, more hopeful. And when they disappeared, it felt as though that version of you disappeared too. But it didn't. The feeling belonged to you. The person may have helped bring it out, but they didn't own it. And that's an important distinction. The most powerful word in an unfinished relationship is probably, what if? What if we had met earlier? What if I had been honest? What if they were afraid too? What if they actually liked me? What if we had tried? The problem is that what if has no natural endpoint. You can answer one question and create another. What if I had told them, okay, then what? What if they said yes? Then what? What if we became a couple? Then what? Your mind can build an entire alternate life that never existed. And because it never existed, it can never disappoint you. That's why imagined relationships can sometimes feel strangely safe. They cannot argue with you. They cannot reject you today. They cannot change their mind tomorrow. They exist exactly as your mind remembers them. You might wonder, if I know all of this, why do they still pop into my head? Because memory isn't a simple filing cabinet. Your brain connects memories to emotions, locations, sounds, routines, and experiences. A song can bring back a person. A street can bring back a conversation. A particular time of day can bring back a feeling. And sometimes the trigger isn't even obvious. You might suddenly think about them while doing something completely unrelated. That doesn't necessarily mean they're thinking about you. It doesn't mean the universe is sending you a sign. And it doesn't automatically mean you were meant to be together. It may simply mean that your brain formed a strong emotional association. Understanding that can actually be comforting, because it means the thought doesn't have to control you. A thought is not a command. A memory is not a message. And an emotion is not always evidence. There comes a point where remembering someone stops being meaningful and starts keeping you stuck. You replay the same conversations. You check their social media. You imagine future scenarios. You interpret every tiny interaction. You compare everyone else to them. And slowly, the person becomes more important in your imagination than people who actually exist in your life. That's when it's worth asking yourself a difficult question. Am I missing them, or am I protecting a fantasy? Because sometimes letting go doesn't mean deciding that the person wasn't special. It means accepting that you don't know what would have happened, and you don't need to know. You can appreciate what the experience made you feel without turning it into a lifelong unanswered question. This may be the hardest part. Sometimes we believe closure has to come from another person. We think, if they just told me how they felt, I'd finally move on. Maybe. But sometimes you can spend years waiting for an answer that may never come. Closure can also come from accepting uncertainty. Maybe they liked you. Maybe they didn't. Maybe the connection was mutual. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe something could have happened. Maybe it wouldn't have worked at all. You don't have to solve every possibility. You only have to accept the reality you actually have. And the reality is simple. You are here. They are somewhere else. And your life is still moving. Maybe they showed you what kind of connection you want. Maybe they revealed how deeply you are capable of feeling. Maybe they made you realize that you want someone who listens. Maybe they taught you that you need emotional honesty. Maybe they showed you a part of yourself you had forgotten. That experience can have value without becoming a relationship. Not every meaningful person is meant to stay. Some people enter our lives briefly, and still change something inside us. But changing you doesn't necessarily mean they belong in your future. Sometimes their role was simply to reveal something, and once you've learned it, you can move forward. So why can't you forget them? Maybe because the story never finished. Maybe because you built a possibility around a few real moments. Maybe because uncertainty kept your mind searching. Maybe because you idealized what you never had to experience in reality. Maybe because that person represents a feeling you deeply wanted. Or maybe because you're still waiting for permission to let go. But here's something important. You don't need permission. You don't have to hate them. You don't have to convince yourself they were meaningless. You don't even have to erase the memories. You simply have to stop confusing memory with destiny. You can remember someone and still move forward. You can appreciate a connection without building your entire future around it. You can admit that something mattered to you without deciding that it was meant to last forever. And perhaps the strangest truth is this. Sometimes the person you can't forget isn't the person you were supposed to end up with. Sometimes they're simply the person who helped you understand what you were looking for. And once you understand that, the story can finally end. Not because the person stopped mattering, but because you stopped needing the story to become something it never was. And maybe that's what moving on really means. Not forgetting, not pretending you never cared, but finally allowing reality to be enough. Because there is a life waiting for you outside the story you keep replaying in your head. And unlike the imaginary version of the past, that life can actually happen. So if there's someone you never dated, someone you still think about, someone who exists more in your memories than in your life, ask yourself one final question. Do I actually miss them? Or do I miss the possibility of who we could have been? The answer might change everything.